help yourself, enjoy. We hope you'll linger afterwards to talk to some of our speakers and have a chance to socialize.
Yeah.
In order to continue to raise awareness,
Okay.
yeah, Valerie would like to make sure that there's not anyone in the group that doesn't want the picture taken. In which case she will.
I'm going to take it. I'm going to take it.
It's fine with me, Valerie. In order to continue to raise awareness for this topic, we did put on our poster. I haven't seen anything walk in the door, but hopefully it will in a few days. We're collecting items that may have PFOA in them, and we're collaborating with some of the local artists in the community to design and construct sculpture, which will not degrade. We're not going to have it degrade. I was asked that earlier, of these items. If you didn't bring something tonight, we will collect it between now and, say, the 5th of July. And if you'll contact either me or Kendall, where would you like those items to be delivered?
Probably my garage for now.
All right, just give us a call and we'll let you know where to bring it, or maybe we'll come and pick it up. We'll gladly accept everything. And on our poster, which is around here somewhere, there are a list of items. I'm sure tonight you'll find out some of the items that have PFOA in them. We would appreciate if you bring paint cans or things like that that have coating in them, that they are empty and clean, because they're going to be used by the designers. There'll be a call for artists coming up, and you'll see it in the newspaper in the next week or two, and we hope to have the installation in late summer or early fall, so stay tuned. One last message for everyone. There is a sign-up sheet going around. If you didn't sign up when you first came in, please sign up now. If we already have your email, you don't have to tell us again, but please give us a current email so we can contact you. And if you do like the programming that we're bringing tonight and some of our other programs that we do for the community, please consider becoming a member or donating. We can't sustain ourselves without our membership and our volunteerism. It's just really important. We are planning some more volunteer activities, and we appreciate and know that many of our members want to do things, and we want to make that happen for you. But we have many good projects going on. Please read our newsletter and get those, and we'll be happy to answer any questions after the meeting. So thank you for being here. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Charles Woods. He's a retired professor from the University of Florida and a current resident of Morgan, Vermont. We're very happy to have him here, and I'll let him introduce our panel.
Welcome, everybody. We're lucky we live in such a beautiful place, and we're all concerned about keeping it beautiful and learning how we are threatened in various ways and how to try and feel our way into the future so that it always stays beautiful. What we're going to do this evening is have 4 speakers who've looked at various ways in which things can go wrong or have gone wrong, or how we can keep them from going wrong, both from the activist, environmental sort of way, or looking at it very scientifically and following these things to the system. We're going to do it so that each one has a chance to speak about 15 or thereabout minutes. We're going to use some visuals, and we'll do them one after another so that we have all 4 rather than start a question and answer period after each. I know that you could have done it that way too, but it rolled it up a little bit more this way, because some of them work closely together, and gives them a chance to answer questions jointly, really work around it. So that's the plan. We're going to start out with Emily Marks. It's a Marquise, it's spelled Marquise, but it's a Portuguese Marks. She's from the University of Rhode Island in Kingston. She's a graduate student. Can you all hear me? Mm-hmm. She's a graduate student of Dr. Slitz, who was planning on being here, who's in the School of Toxicology and Pharmacology. That's where Emily's PhD will be. And she's driven 4.5 hours from Kingston to be here. It's a long, arduous journey. Dr. Slitz couldn't be here because her husband's in the National Guard and has just gone off on training duty and has left Dr. Slitz with 4 kids behind. And it was very hard to do all of that. School's just out, and so she was not able to slip away. She tried very hard to be here, but we're delighted to have Emily. I'll introduce these persons just as they begin. So, go ahead, Emily.
Can everybody hear me, or should I use the microphone? I do have a quiet voice. Yeah?
Here. You turn it on? I did the same thing.
There we go. Everyone can hear me?
Yeah.
All right. So I am from the URI Superfund Center, which is funded by the NIH. Our Superfund title is called STEEP, Sources, Transport, Exposure, and Effects of PFASs. So what are PFASs? It's actually a big, long chemical name, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. We just like to use the name PFASs. So what's unique about PFASs is that these molecules contain fluorine, which allows them to persist in the environment, so they do not degrade. However, they do have a lot of very unique properties that make these compounds very useful. They have a very wide array of usages. What's concerning about these compounds is that most everybody has these compounds in their blood. About 98% of Americans have to have one of these 4 different PFASs in their blood: PFAS, PFOA, PFHXS, and PFNA. So our Superfund Center is focused on these compounds and trying to understand the health effects, how these get into the environment, and what we can do to address these compounds. So where are these compounds found? Like I said earlier, they have a very diverse set of usages, from food packaging and PFAS-containing materials. There was actually a very interesting study that was just released by the FDA that looked at food, and they do find these compounds in food. Commercial household products, anything kind of non-stick. So Teflon, carpeting, Scotchgard has used these in their carpeting for a while, although they've phased out PFAS and PFOA. There are new replacements out there. Firefighting foams, which is a major concern for us on the Cape. These firefighting foams contain these molecules so they can put out gasoline fires that are actually very difficult to put out. Workplaces, so a lot of industries, chrome cleaning, electronics, use these compounds. There is a lot of concern about drinking water. These compounds do partition into drinking water as well, and as well as organisms. So one of our concerns is measuring these in organisms as they go up the food chain. So we have some very interesting work going on in actually seabirds down in Narragansett. So my talk is mostly focused on health effects of what these compounds actually do in the body. And the first question we always ask is, where do they go? So if you look at the picture of the body, the first place they love to go is the liver. So they love to accumulate, which is very different than a lot of the other compounds out there, which actually prefer fat. If you think of like phthalates, DTT, they usually partition to fat. PFAS actually go to the liver. Kidneys are another big source. Thyroid, as well as blood. These compounds like to bind to proteins. And so your blood has a lot of proteins, so they tend to stay around in your blood. And that's how they actually stay in your body for quite a period of time. One of the other areas of concern is these compounds do actually cross the barrier into the womb. So children can be exposed to PFASs even before they're born. So these are compounds that we do want to know a lot about these health effects because, they can affect kids very early on in life. So I mentioned where these go. The next question is, how long are they going to be there? And the answer is quite a while. So why? I kind of mentioned this earlier, they like to bind to proteins. So they like to bind to proteins in the liver, in the serum, in the kidney. There's actually concern about being reuptaken. So your body has a system where it reuptakes the good things back into your blood. So you kind of secrete everything through your kidney and then it reuptakes everything, and these compounds actually utilize that process. And so we usually use the term half-life to denote how long, but these compounds can stay, specifically PFAS and PFOA, for up to, PFAS right here, for up to 6 or so years. So this is why we do want to know what's going on with these compounds. What are they doing in the body once they get there? So I came up with a short list of all the different health effects. I'm going to focus on a couple to go in a little bit more detail, but this is the general list. So I have kind of the technical language here, and then what it actually means. So one of the first effects is the increase in serum cholesterol. And so what that means is that if you're exposed to these compounds, you can potentially have high cholesterol. There are immune effects, which means that you can have a reduced vaccine effectiveness, which means your vaccines that are supposed to protect you from disease aren't working. There are markers of liver damage. So this is what ALT is. It's a protein that is secreted when your liver's being harmed by chemicals, some drugs. Tylenol is also one of those drugs that'll harm your liver, and that can cause liver damage. Hepatomegaly. This is really only seen in rodents, but there are some concerns about it happening in humans. It's kind of unclear because nobody wants to, give a biopsy to measure the fat in their liver. But what it means is your liver kind of expands and fills with fat. And if you know anything about the liver is an important organ for filtration. And when you have fat, your liver is not going to work effectively. There's developmental toxicity. This is one of the major concerns. So there are health advisories out there for PFAS and PFOA from the EPA. They are actually based on developmental toxicity endpoints. And one of the endpoints that was actually used to derive their 70 parts per trillion value from the EPA was low birth weight. There are some thyroid disease effects. In humans, we actually see hyperthyroidism, so your hormones for your thyroid hormones are actually elevated, which is actually the opposite of what we see in rodents. But that's one of the discrepancies in this model and some of the challenges when we're talking about these health effects, how to define them. And then for renal effects, we actually see reduced kidney function. So again, another important organ for filtering out your blood, getting rid of any general toxins your body has, also can have reduced kidney function. So an interesting story. So PFOA, which I'm sure you've probably heard of. PFOA has been in the media quite a lot lately. As part of a class action lawsuit, the members of the DuPont Washington Water Works plant in West Virginia actually sued DuPont for having high levels of PFOA in their water. And we actually had the lawyer who actually created this class action lawsuit come to our Superfund Center, Rob Ballot. And one of the very unique things that happened out of this settlement was they created what's called the C8 Health Panel. So PFOA has 8 carbons. That's where the C8 comes from, 8 carbons. PFAS also has 8 carbons, but it's a little different. And what they did was to try to understand what PFOA is doing. So the company the company knew that they had a problem, but they kept arguing to the people of West Virginia that we don't know what the effects are. We don't know what's going on is bad. So what they did was say, instead of taking the money from DuPont from their settlement, they funded what's called the C8 Health Panel. And it was an epidemiological study that actually created a lot of our base knowledge of what PFOA does in the body. Let's see. So what did the C8 Health Panel find? So what they did is they did a study from 2005 to 2013, and they looked for, of the people of West Virginia, what health effects might be associated with this compound, what kind of diseases are, what kind of diseases are there higher incidence of. And so what's important here is this study was really based on kind of legal causation. So in West Virginia law, a probable link is sufficient enough for them to have a legal cause to sue. But that does not necessarily mean that there is a causation. It requires more studies, so not just one epidemiological study, but multiple. So that is one of the struggles with these compounds is it's kind of, you can't really give people something toxic and say, oh, we're going to give this to you and see what's done, what's going on. I don't know anyone who would sign up for that study. So we have to kind of use different methods and different tools to really identify what are they doing and is it bad and just how bad. So I'm going to focus on two different effects just to give you guys a little bit more in-depth background and what we're doing at URI to kind of help further the knowledge. So one of the main effects is developmental toxicity. I mentioned this was one of the effects that was used to create our health values. And one of the challenges in toxicology is we always think of the dose versus the disease. So depending on how much, it'll have certain effects. So developmental toxicity was kind of chosen as an endpoint to create the numbers, to say this is bad, you can't go any higher than that. But it doesn't mean that there are other effects that might be as concerning. This was just based on the current knowledge that EPA had when they made the health limit. So why developmental toxicity matters, this is one of the main reasons they chose this endpoint, is PFAS can cross the placenta and be transferred through breast milk. So like I mentioned earlier, children before they're born are being exposed to these compounds. And if there are developmental effects, they're considered very serious. So what's really been found, so a lot of what we know comes from PFOA and actually the C8 Health Panel. PFOA decreased fetal growth in both human and non-human mammalian species. In humans, a couple other of these compounds that are similar in structure were found to increase the risk of preterm birth, as well as decrease birth weight. And other studies associate PFAS for, it's an endpoint, small for gestational age. So what this really means is that PFAS exposure can affect how a fetus grows. One of our areas that we're really focused on, at least in my lab with Dr. Slitt, is the liver. And so why we think the liver matters is that the liver, relatively speaking, has very high concentrations of PFAS. PFAS like to be in the liver. So we want to know kind of what's going on there. And unfortunately, because of the liver being such an important organ, it's not very easy to study in humans. So we have to really look at rodent models and cell models to really understand what's going on in the liver. So what has been found In humans, we see elevations in serum liver enzymes. So this is that ALT that's secreted when liver cells die. And what can actually happen is when you have liver damage, it actually increases your risk for cancer, for liver cancer, and other liver endpoints later in life. Rodent studies demonstrate hepatomegaly. So this is when the liver gets enlarged, usually with fat. And this endpoint is kind of widely debated due to a specific endpoint because rodents do differ from humans. But hepatomegaly in rodent studies suggests that some PFAS might also be associated with fatty liver disease and metabolic syndrome. So what are we doing at URI? So we have a whole host of different PFASs. Obviously, we're going to take the PFASs we know a lot about, like PFAS and PFOA, as well as some that we know something about, like PFHXS, which is used very heavily in film-forming foams, and some that we actually know very little about. PFBS, which is one of the replacements for PFAS and PFHX, and GenX, a replacement for PFOA. And what we do is we treat cells in lab. I have hepatocytes that I culture. They're actually from human donors. So this is a little picture, I'm not sure if you can see it here on the screen, where we take liver donors and isolate the hepatocytes, and then we can actually grow them on culture. And then we treat them with the different PFASs and kind of measure the different effects that we see. And our plan is to really understand whether there's a relationship between the different PFASs and the effects in the livers based on our cell models. So I do only have one slide on data, but the takeaway from this slide is really that some of the replacements may be more potent. So PFBS has a shorter half-life, so it stays in the body a little bit longer, a little bit shorter than PFAS and PFHXS. But one of the things I kind of want you to take away is this measurement here in red. So this means some of the endpoints are going up. At high concentrations, these endpoints go up in PFAS and PFHXS, but when you look at the lower concentrations, there's not much there. It's pretty close to that nothing happening white color. But when you get to PFBS, even at the lower concentrations, we see a lot of these different endpoints that we're measuring in our livers go up. So we do really want to, the point of this is really the replacements may not even be better. We know much less about, and we know a little bit about what they're doing in liver, but one of our things we always say in the Superfund Center is we do think these compounds need to be regulated as a class. Just because you have a shorter chain length of carbon doesn't mean it's not doing some of the same things that's going on with the longer chains. So how does this relate back to you? So by helping to understand these properties of PFASs, what they're doing in liver cells, growing in the lab, we hope to have more accurate values so that when you go into the environment, you kind of know, well, that's safe. This is low or between this level, or maybe it's not safe, the levels are too high, and what you can do to reduce your exposure. So just some quick acknowledgements. The pictures aren't coming out, but that's my PI, Angela Slitt. She couldn't be here today, but that's her very blurry picture. As well as some of our collaborators in the College of Engineering at URI and the Both-In Lab group. So thanks for listening. I do have some materials, some tips for families on how to reduce your exposure, what to do. And if you want to learn more about our Superfund Center or learn more about PFASs, we have some great resources on our website, uri.edu/steep. So I'll move on.
Emily. Thank you. Very informative. Moving on, Richard Spees, who's in the Department of Environmental Conservation in Montpelier. Didn't come 4.5 hours, although it's a long way to Montpelier. And he works on policy and on sampling standards. He's worked widely through the state, especially in Bennington. We're all aware of the big problems that were associated in Bennington with the groundwater. Quite a phenomenal problem. And with the National Guard, Air National Guard base, he's worked both places. And he will give us some insight into sampling standards and policies. Richard Spees.
Appreciate that. I think I can get away without a microphone, hopefully. That was an excellent talk. Very heavy, though. Mine is much lighter. This will be a quick trip through Bennington. So let's get started. Maybe. So just a quick overview. I have some of the similar slides. One of the nice things you'll see is I have very similar health effects as Emily had, so that should hopefully build some confidence that we have a clue of what we're talking about. And then also talk about the initial response that we did in Bennington, how I got involved, what happened when we went there, a little bit about how we investigated the site, and then the rest of it's not that important. Again, PFOA, PFOS are the main contaminants that people studied historically, and in 2002, EPA started getting very interested in these two chemicals in particular, and they worked with industry to do a voluntary phase-out program for these two chemicals only. It's called the 2010-2015 phase-out, and basically by 2015, there's supposed to be almost no PFOA or PFOS being manufactured in the United States or being distributed as a product. That's a great thing, except for, as you heard, industry, being who they are, went out and found similar products that do the same things, and we don't know what the toxicology of a lot of those are, and some of them may be just as bad or worse than the ones that we're replacing, so that's a problem. The other thing that, on the treatment side, these chemicals are much easier to filter than some of the shortages that we deal with. And so, if you happen to get contaminated water and we have to filter it out of your water going into your home, it's much more difficult and costly to do that. As opposed to these chemicals, it's still difficult, but comparatively, it's relatively easy. So that's something to think about. And in Bennington, although there were many, many different PFASs that we found, the number one of concern, and that was in almost every water supply above standards, was the PFOA, the 8-carbon carboxylate. So again, it's in Teflon production. There's been a lot of debate about is it actually in Teflon or is it just in the production. My understanding is it's used, PFOA is used in the production of Teflon, and in the process of baking the Teflon onto the product, the pan, or I'll show you the product that was made in Bennington, the PFOA is driven off. And so you're not being exposed to PFOA. Although Teflon is a similar chemical, it's thousands of carbons long. And that's why it's such a good product as far as not having anything stick to it, because it's so large and it has all of these fluorines on it. That's a very tight bond that nothing can stick to it. Electronics, Scotchgard, as we talked about, Gore-Tex, firefighting foam. I've done a lot of work with that. I work on a national work group, working on writing up some documentation for best management practices for dealing with using firefighting foams. And then textile coating, which is what they were doing in Bennington. And then again, the health effects I'm not going to go through because she did, but the one thing that's interesting is in Vermont, unlike EPA, our health department, state toxicologists, went through the same calculations but used a different endpoint. I believe, although don't quote me on this, it's a nursing child between 0 to 1 years as opposed to a prenatal child. So when EPA did theirs, they came up with 70 doing the calculations. We used the same slope factors for risk and everything, but because we had a different endpoint, we got a lower standard for the state. And it's 20 nanograms per liter. At the time that we were doing most of Bennington, it was PFOA, PFOS, but now they've added 3 more compounds to that list. So there are 5 different PFASs that are added together, that if all 5 of those added together are greater than 20 parts per trillion, or 20 nanograms per liter, then that would exceed our standard, and that would trigger certain responses. And that would be something we wouldn't want you to be exposed to above that standard. Why is PFAS such a good, oh, that's another, the other big debate, is it PFASs or is it PFAS? So that's always one of the fun things that we get to debate as well. Is there an S on the end of it? Just kind of some of the silly things that we do. But why is it such a great contaminant? It doesn't biodegrade. Because it loves protein, it's found in the blood serum, and it's in wildlife nationwide and worldwide. It's in soils all over Vermont, which Wenyu will talk about when she gives her talk. It's in soils all over the world. It's in the polar ice caps. Fate and transport's not well understood, just like the toxicology. It's a very complicated molecule to figure out how it actually moves through the environment. We did a lot of work, and John Kim will talk about some of the work that he did, trying to understand how it moves through the geology of Bennington County. But even with all the work we did, and we put many thousands of hours of work into it and hundreds of thousands of dollars, we still only have a limited understanding on how it moves through the environment and gets into people's wells. And then there's a lot of discussion about, well, how does it absorb the soil and how does it move through soil and get into groundwater, which is then the water that many of us drink. We went through that. This is our molecule, why it's so tough, why it lasts so long. This connection right here, the carbon-fluorine bond, is the tightest bond known in nature. It's actually not found in nature, it's only created by humans. And it's very hard for anything to get in there and break that bond and get energy out of it. And therefore, it's very resistant in the environment. As I said, why is it an environmental concern? It bioaccumulates. We think it moves around the atmosphere around the world. It gets deposited everywhere, in polar ice caps, in the ocean, and in Vermont soils, unfortunately. And then it moves up the food chain. In addition to that, if it gets in your water column, because it loves protein, as the fish breathe, it gets into their gills and then gets into their bloodstream, and then it has an opportunity to accumulate that way also, not just by eating things, but also by just breathing in the water. So how did this whole thing start in Vermont? In January of 2016, Aaron Brockovich, yes, of Aaron Brockovich fame, went to Bennington College to give a talk about what was going on in Hoosick Falls. And what's amazing to me is thinking that we feel like we're kind of dialed in with our New England partners and what's going on. We really didn't know much about PFAS prior to this event in 2016. There was a lot of reasons maybe why we should have. Parkersburg was a good example that Emily talked about. Huge contaminated site in West Virginia. There was already a lot of work going on with 3M in Minnesota. Minnesota had been working on trying to clean up PFAS sites in Minnesota for over 10 years prior to 2016. And then a couple of years before 2016, also Peace Air Force Base's drinking water wells got contaminated from Peace. And then a year before that, Hoosick Falls had their contaminant problem right across the border from Bennington. So because of all that, maybe we should have known more, but honestly, it was not on our radar. We were busily working on hazardous waste sites all over the state and never really thought about this. Brockovich went to Bennington in end of January, was giving a talk in Bennington College, and one of the people in the audience, an audience much like you, just said, hey, we have a plant very similar to the one in Hoosick right down the hill. It's only like 300 yards from here. I wonder if that could be a problem. And that person talked to their state rep, who talked to the governor, who talked to our secretary, who talked to my boss. And my boss said, well, who would be a good person to work on this? And he said, hey, Richard, you worked on that building where that thing was on for a different problem. They had a leaking tank at one time that I helped get cleaned up. And you saw that webinar last year on Peace Air Force Base in New Hampshire. You're our expert. Go check that out. I'm like, oh, okay. So I remember very well, but we're looking at aerial photos, trying to pick the Vermont Atlas, trying to pick out drinking water wells we want to go and sample, contacting people, working with our contractor to write up a sampling procedure and what our data quality objectives would be with the lab to make sure we could actually analyze for this chemical and we had the right detection limits. And I'm driving down there with our contractor to get the samples, and I'm thinking, we're not going to find anything. This plant's been out of business for 14 years, and it's going to be nothing. Well, we sampled 5 private water systems in the public water supply in North Bennington, and all 5 private water supply samples were contaminated. We got the results on a Thursday morning. I called my boss, he talked to the governor, and right away, within 2 hours of that notification, the governor set up a press conference to tell the people of Bennington and the people of Vermont that we had this problem. And what were we going to do about it? So here we go. We were off and running, and the PFAS has been a big part of my life ever since. So again, what was it they were doing in Bennington? For people who don't know, that's Denver International Airport. You know the big tents that are on top of it, or on top of the Superdome? Those tents were baked in Bennington, Vermont. And basically what they do is they coat the tent, they coat the cloth material with this Teflon material, and they use the PFOA as a surfactant to make sure the Teflon spreads out nice and evenly over the tent. And then they bake it. And so they bake the Teflon into the tent material, and the PFOA is driven off. And we had many complaints through the years of emission problems from neighbors in Bennington. I know them all very well. I've spoken with them any number of times. And a lot of what I think of what they were smelling was ammonia that was driven off. That was because this material came in as a salt, which had an ammonia attached to it. Then in the process, the ammonia would detach. And then there were also some hydrocarbon issues that we were permitting. But PFOA was not on our radar at all. There was never anyone knew that maybe we should be making sure that this stuff was not being emitted into the environment. And for better or for worse, the company that ran in Bennington moved their manufacturing procedure to Memphremagog, New Hampshire, which also has similar problems to what we have. And now the state of New Hampshire is trying to deal with the problem and figure out how to make sure they don't emit levels of PFOA that could harm the environment and human health. So the facility opened in 1969 on Northside Drive in Bennington. The people who opened it had the best of intentions. They had worked for DuPont. They knew that area, Hoosick Falls, Bennington, Pownell, were depressed areas. We can bring business here. We can bring jobs here. This is good. And they thought this was a great process, and they brought it there to try and set up manufacturing to help their community. They were all from that area. They moved away. They got their degrees. They moved away, worked for DuPont, came back. Hey, they thought they were doing the right thing at the time. Now, did they know things as they moved along that maybe they could have prevented some of these emissions? Possibly. But at least in the beginning, they thought it was a great thing. They expanded so much that by 1978, they moved to a larger facility on Water Street in North Bennington. I have a map that shows that. And again, the PFOA was the main dispersant, and it wasn't a regulated compound, so it wasn't on anyone's map. So we show up on our first meeting. As I mentioned, it was on a Thursday. We got the results. Friday night, we had a public meeting. 150 people there, 6 different newspapers, 3 different TV stations. It was a big show. Thank goodness for the people, the professors from Bennington College. They helped keep the crowd kind of calm. Things were getting pretty intense. But the commissioner, 5 minutes before the meeting, says, "Okay, Richard, who knows most about it? What are we going to tell people how far we're going to sample?" I'm like, that's not the way we do it. We just kind of move out from the facility and sample more and more wells, and as we find more and more problems, we just keep going further out. She goes, "No, that's not going to work here. What area should we use?" So I very quickly looked at the results and the distances of the wells that I sampled and said, okay, based on this, should be about 1.2 miles should be a non-detect level if the ratios are appropriate and the extrapolation is consistent. And so safety factor, how about 1.5 miles? We'll do 1.5 miles radius around the plant. And anyone who's inside that, give us a call. We'll come and sample your well. We immediately provided bottled water. I think I have a picture about that in a minute. And it was a good thing I picked 1.5 miles because the left side of that picture is right on the New York State border. So if I picked 2 miles, we would have been sampling wells in New York State, and that wouldn't have been good for Vermont regulators. But the red dots are wells that have over 1,000 parts per trillion PFOA in them. The orange have over 100, which is still way over our standard. And I think there's some yellow in there that are between 20, which is our standard, and 100. And then there are some others that are non-detect. And John will do a lot of this talking or describing about why some of these wells that are right next to wells that are contaminated aren't contaminated. And it's a very interesting study to try and figure all that out. So as I said, we provided bottled water. It was a great thing. We brought the water down the first day to the North Bennington Fire Station. And of course, they're closed a lot. It's hard for people to get water. Well, one of the store owners down there said, "Hey, I'm open all the time, and I have a huge warehouse out back. Bring all the water you want, and store it there, and I'll give it out." And so we're like, okay, sure. So this store is actually on the east side of Bennington, which came later, but the other store is on the west side. It was a great collaborative effort with some of our local store owners to get water out to the people. They were very diligent. They're like, should we ask people where they live and how much water they can have? I'm like, no, just give them whatever they want. If they come in and say they want water, I don't care if they live in the area, just give it to them. We'll figure it out later. Like, this was in the very early days and there was a lot going on. Fortunately, for better or for worse, in the end, Saint-Gobain, the responsible party for this issue, stepped up and said, just send us the water bills. And they've been paying water bills ever since, and they're still paying some water bills down there for people who are still getting bottled water. So of the initial 50 results, we had some non-detects, we had some that were greater than 100 and actually 1,000 parts per trillion. We immediately started working with those people, not only to get them bottled water, and originally it was go to the store and get it, but we got it to where the water companies that drive around could bring them right to your home, but that took weeks and weeks to get set up. And within weeks, Saint-Gobain hired Culligan Water, who came down, and they were putting in originally dozens and eventually hundreds of point-of-entry treatment systems, and they're pretty large. And all the water would come into the house and go through this treatment system that would filter the PFOA out of their water. There were obviously problems. Water pressure went down. It's because the water has to be in the tanks for a certain amount of time for the process to work. And so they have to restrict the flow, so it has that time, which reduces the pressure in the home. We heard a lot about that. And then there's another problem that I'll get to in a minute. So as I mentioned, we had immediate notification, treatment systems all over, bottled water. One of the interesting things, people were worried about their soil. Hey, if this stuff went out of the stack, it's in my soil, it gets into the groundwater, how bad's the soil? I'm like, oh my God, think about it. If it's bad enough that it's above standards in soil, how are we going to deal with this? I mean, this is where these people live. We can't just dig up all our yards and all these things. I'm not sure how we manage that. So, but we had to get the data before we could decide. And a lot of outreach, public meetings. We're still doing periodic email blasts. There's a list of about 900 people who have signed up to get emails from us that we send out. Originally, it was almost weekly. Now it's probably every 6 or 8 weeks. As I said, public meetings, press releases, and the governor's press conferences. So where are we now? We've sampled over 600 private water supplies. There it says 2, but now it's been 3 years. About half were above standards, so just over 300. Over 400 have detects of some level, which obviously people are concerned. The EPA advisory was adopted in May of 2016, a lot of pressure on them. We adopted ours actually before that. I was amazed how quickly the state toxicologists could do the work to actually turn out a standard, which was excellent. And there are standards all over the place around the country. Some states have no standards. They can be no more stringent than the federal government. So if the federal government doesn't have a standard, they can't have a standard. New Jersey's adopted a much lower level. New Hampshire passed a law last year to set a standard, and their toxicologist is working, and it's slightly above 20, but less than 70. So there's a lot of interesting work going on to figure out what the level should be. And this is what our map looks like today. There's a lot of dots there, as you can see. The original circle, I don't know if is on the left side of the map where all the oranges and the reds are. And then as we moved to the east, we found more and more contaminated water supplies all the way up to the Green Mountains. So we have it from the state of New York, and there's actually contaminated wells in New York, but New York is dealing with that. And we do collaborate with them on what's going on. All the way up to the Green Mountains, where fortunately the next town is 10 miles away in Woodford, up to Shaftesbury, and then down to where the public water system in Bennington City supplies water. And we've sampled a number of wells to the south and haven't found contamination, so that's good. And the public water systems are, for North Bennington and Bennington, are on the edges of the Green Mountains, and we've not seen any impacts in any of them in all the sampling that we've done. So some of the big challenges, the magnitude of the area, the biggest site I've ever worked on, a lot of people have concerns and needs, and we have to try and address them. That takes a lot of time. A lot of work about other possible sources. Ever-Ready Battery was there. Johnson Controls, who made die-hard batteries, battery manufacturers is a possible source. And there are other possible sources. And of course, Saint-Gobain's consultant is saying, well, what about these other potential sources? Are you looking at those? So we spent a lot of time working through that. Setting up health advisory levels for water, for soil, which we have one. Crops, a lot of interest, a lot of gardens. People were really concerned about the food they're eating. And the fish, we immediately got down there. I have some slides about that. I got to keep moving. The blood sampling effort, there was a lot of interest in people having their blood sampled, even though we knew if you have contaminated water, you're going to have higher levels in your blood serum. I'm trying to understand the fate and transport. That's a lot of what I had to do. I mentioned there were other problems with these point of entry treatment systems when they first went in. There was elevated arsenic levels coming out of the end of the point of entry treatment system. And I think it's part of the manufacturing process of creating the carbon, but after you flush several hundred gallons of clean oxygenated water through it, you change the chemistry of the carbon, and all the arsenic that is in there then that was originally mobile becomes immobile, and so it doesn't get into the water. So we had to measure for that and explain that to people. And the answer for that eventually was we set up the systems beforehand and pre-flushed them with hundreds and hundreds of gallons of water and then sampled them before we took them to people's homes. But it took us several months to set up that process. And people wanted answers and they wanted remedies. And one of the answers that Emily talked about, well, what level is it at risk? At what level is it going to impact me? I have it in my well at this level. Am I at risk? And there's no answer for that question. And that really frustrates people that there's no answer. All we can say is, we'll tell you doctors what to look for, go there, and get these tests done, and we'll see if it creates a problem or not. This isn't a good slide, but there are dots on there that show we sampled surface water, and here's our guy out there shocking the river to collect fish. We found elevated levels of PFAS, all the chemicals in the fish, but not really elevated levels of PFOA. And the reason for that, we think, is that PFOA does not bioaccumulate in fish as readily as PFOS. And it's because of the sulfonate versus the carboxylate that how much it bioaccumulates in the fish. So we actually found elevated PFOS in fish, but we really didn't have PFOS coming from the facility that we were studying. We sampled soils all around the plant. The plant is the white in the middle, and all those purple dots are places that we sampled soil samples. And really what the standard that the health department set for direct contact to soils was 300 parts per billion. So that's quite a bit higher than 20 parts per trillion. And that's because you drink a lot of water, you don't eat a lot of dirt. It's just the way it is. But what this study really showed for us was that the graph on the bottom of it is that the one on the left side is 0 to 500 feet from the plant, all those samples. Much higher levels as you moved away from the plant, up to 2,500 feet away, about a half a mile, levels went down. And we continued to see that as we sampled further away from the plant. John's going to talk a lot about the work that he did trying to do geologic studying, so I'll fly through that. Go ahead and all these same slides so you can get his. And these are all the different things that he and his group did to try and understand how things move through the aquifer down in Bennington. There was a lot of work going on about, probably of interest to people here, on sludge and septage down there. There were elevated levels in the sludge at the wastewater treatment plant, high levels going in the water that was coming in, about 8 parts per billion average found in sludge samples. What was interesting was then we went down and sampled some of the compost in Williamstown, Massachusetts, where their sludge went and was composted, and levels were much lower. And whether that's because other things are mixed in, so we get some dilution, or maybe the compost is much drier and a lot of the PFOA may have stayed in the water vapor or the water form as it got taken out of the compost. Not really sure, but what we know is that the levels were much lower. What was interesting was there's a process that you can flush water through soil samples or sludge samples to get the PFOA out of it. Even in samples where we could not detect anything in the soil, we could still get something in the water moving through it. A very interesting thing to say that at what level is it safe? We're not really sure, but what do we really know when we sample soil and we get our results? For farming, we really didn't expect to see much uptake in the plants from the soil, as long as people use clean water for irrigation and clean compost, wash things. There may be low levels of uptake in some plants, but it was really hard for us to go and figure it out in every plant. We're not a research entity, so we were like, what's the best management practice? And so that's what we put out there. Same thing for livestock. Make sure you drink clean water. There was one person who had a small goat farm, chicken farm down there. They had pallets of 5-gallon things of water, and unfortunately they had to haul them to their animals until they could get municipal water brought in. But that was the only way we could go to get them clean water for their animals, and that's the best solution to make sure that then their eggs or the meat was clean. And people were really concerned about maple syrup, so we took a maple syrup sample from right there. We had an elevated detection limit because the syrup is viscous and dark and thick, hard to do an analysis on, but we didn't have anything out of detection limit. Later, Bennington College did something on some sap. They found very low levels of PFOA, like 8 parts per trillion in the water that was coming up the tree and ended up in the bucket. So there were low levels in the sap, but again, how much maple syrup do you drink compared to water? What's the risk? Relatively, it's low. Nothing has no risk, but it's relatively low. And our report to the people was, there's no reason you shouldn't use and consume your maple syrup. We mentioned the blood serum. Originally, it was 400 people. I think it's over 600 people now. In Bennington, the average is about 10 parts per billion, and the graph on the bottom is just the distribution of levels. The right is much, much higher, and those are all people who worked in the plant. So people who are working in the plant were being exposed to much higher levels of PFOA than even the people who were drinking lots of water with the highest levels. I'm going to skip over that. So I went through a lot of the work. We put over 300 point of entry treatment systems. I think people may have heard we've already installed water lines on half of the wells in Bennington that were contaminated on the west side of town. And right now we're in the process of hiring contractors to install water lines on the east side of town. That's going to take care of about 90% of the people who have contaminated wells that are in the more densely populated, closer areas. And the people on the outlying areas, our plan is to try and drill them a new well. There's some work going on to see if we can find clean water in deeper aquifers, and then grout that to make sure that there's not a connection. If that doesn't work, to provide long-term point of entry treatment system use until levels finally clean up, which no one knows for sure when that'll be, but many, many decades, I'm sure. And these are just some of the different work that we did with our contractor to understand a lot of three-dimensional work. John got us a lot of the data for the geology. They don't come out very well on these slides. And how we define the east side and west side of the site for settlement purposes with Santo Bay. Skip over that. Some of the other large, just 2 more slides. Some of the other large sites in Vermont, Pownell wire coating, same person who owned ChemFab moved and started a wire coating business in Pownell. That particular release contaminated a public water system that supplied about 400 trailer parks and several private wells. And then right down the river, right up the road, is Pownell Tannery, which has a different contaminant that's contaminated a number of private wells. So Pownell got a double whammy. I'm working on the Vermont Air Guard base. They're doing work there right now as we speak to try and understand how this stuff is moving. The main concerns there are an agricultural well that's impacted, a gentleman who has about 450 cows. We have to put a treatment system on his well so that the cows are getting clean water, and then also the Winooski River, because there's pretty good levels coming off of the airport, getting into streams, and then eventually into the river. So we're trying to understand that. IBM has some from their semiconductor work. Nice thing there is they've been trying to clean up other problems for about 30 years, and they've been pumping and treating water using the same technologies that we would use for PFAS, so they've been kind of containing their problem. And then more recently, Rutland Airport also has a large AFFF. And then one of the other great things I've gotten to do is I work with a group called the Interstate Technology and Regulatory Commission. If you really want to do a deep dive in understanding a lot of the issues of PFAS, you can go to that webpage. There are 7 fact sheets right now that talk about usage, regulations, fate and transport, remediation, AFFF, and we're getting very close to putting out a technical regulation, a large document that goes into much more detail than these fact sheets. So I think that's all I have, John, so we should probably pull up your talk and keep moving.
Wow.
Sorry about how we're
Dr. Richard Kemp, Jonathan Kemp, from the Environmental Department in Montpelier. Also, he's a state geologist, geological survey. His specialty is looking downward, finding the aquifer, finding out how things move through the aquifer, and they've worked Richard and Jonathan together on the same project, and Jonathan's also worked at the Rutland Airport on similar projects. So there you go.
I'm just going to go over this again because I just want to point some things out. This is the PFOA molecule, and just okay. So you see that it's 8 carbons, 15 fluorines, and then there's a carboxyl group, an O and OH. This is important to think about because in soils and glacial materials, organic carbon and iron oxides and hydroxides can actually hold on to that end. There are other ends of fortress, but that end is the only reactive side. If you get a chance, Vermont Digger has a 5-part series in their website. It's called Teflon Town, and it goes through everything about Bennington. It's really, really good if you want just some basic information. So this is from that series, but if you look here, these are about 5-foot wide sheets of fiberglass, and they're about to be coated with Teflon, and they're going to go up towards the ceiling where there's this furnace area, and with PFOA is baked off at the temperatures as high as 400 degrees centigrade. And so then you can see on the right, here's the sheets, the rolls going up into essentially up into the furnace area. So Richard pointed this out, that there's the Denver Airport Pavilion, these air-supported roofs at airports and dome stadiums. This is the Carrier Dome in Syracuse, the first dome stadium roof. The Carrier Dome was made in North Bennington. If you have a Gore-Tex jacket, it's no longer made with PFOA because they don't allow it, but they use shorter chains, C6, C5s, and stuff like that. So if you went onto the North Face, Patagonia, or any of your favorite outdoor gear manufacturer websites, you'll see that almost all of them have an environmental statement saying, we no longer use PFOA, but now we use shorter chains because they're friendlier for the environment, and I'll let Emily run with that part. And then that's my favorite cooking pan at home, which also was made with some sort of PFAS. So Richard showed this map, but I just want to use this as a context because essentially this is the whole town of Bennington. And so any well all the wells that were tested, and Richard said there's 620 or something like that. And of the wells here that have yellow, orange, or red, those are wells that are above the standard of 20 parts per trillion in Vermont. And so 300 something, so about half the well, all wells tested, were above the standard. So how do you get there? How do you get to 300 something wells out of 600 in this pretty big town contaminated? So here's a generic diagram I drew off, but basically, if you want to look, imagine this is the Water Street plant right here. And so here we have, remember I was just showing you that those fiberglass rolls are being coated with Teflon, the PFOA is being baked off into the atmosphere, so I call that step A in the fade and transport. Moves along in the atmosphere, see this cloud, that's step B, right? Step C is it's actually going to have to fall out of the atmosphere and reach the ground surface. Step D is when we're talking in the soils and the glacial materials, the superficial materials, it's going to actually be alluviated or infiltrate downward through the unsaturated zone. In the unsaturated zone, that's where the organic carbon and the iron oxide hydroxides could attenuate it, as in hold on to it longer than just having it flush straight through. Then it gets to the superficial aquifer, step E, and then eventually on to the bedrock aquifer, step F. So you see that this is a very complicated cycle, and once you remove the plant, imagine just take this plant and just block it out of your mind. Right now there's still PFOA in the soil, so we're still going through D, E, and F, and in the aquifers, E and F, it's still moving around. So it's not like it's just over when the factory's gone and when it's started to wash through the soil. So at the Geological Survey, I'm lucky enough to work with a bunch of professors and students at local colleges and universities. And what we do is we actually have what what we call aquifer characterization. So the pictures are kind of dark, but it involves, basically if you look at this, we make bedrock geologic maps, superficial geologic maps, we look at all the well records in an area, and then we actually do geophysical well logging, which is, and I'll show you what a little bit more about this is. And this is what we call the three-dimensional part of our survey. We want to know what the framework of the Earth is underneath our feet in 3 dimensions, right? That's really important, because how else are we going to know how things move through? But then what we're going to do is we're going to take 4 different compounds, and PFOA being one of them, but we'll use groundwater major and trace element chemistry. We'll use stable isotopes of hydrogen, deuterium, and oxygen-18, and do that on a number of samples, and then we'll actually do groundwater recharge age dating. So when you put together 4 tracers in a 3-dimensional framework, we actually make it 4-dimensional, and actually can make more of this fate and transport issue. So here's, anyway, I'm just going to go through the parts, what we did, and then in a few minutes I'll just show you kind of what a 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional model might look like. I'm not going to go into great detail. We're in the process of writing up our study, which I'll go over the different parts, and we're hoping to have something written up to submit in the next couple of months. So making a map of the bedrock geology. So here's a geologic map of, this is essentially, there's the plant right there. This is the contamination, a major contamination area. All the different colors here are different rock formations, right? You can see this is pretty complicated. The more the colors, the more, but oh, look at this. These lines with the triangles on them, these are faults. So there's a major fault pair here, there's another fault pair here. So this is the bottom slice. This has been pushed on top of that. That's been pushed up on top of that. While they're being pushed, they're being folded. Okay, anyway, only point, the geology underfoot is complicated. So, then I like that. So then work with a superficial geologist who's mapping the glacial deposits, and they go out and look at sand quarries, dig holes, auger holes, and all, and they put together a map. Here we go. Here we have a superficial geologic map of Bennington. So we have the bedrock underneath our feet, and then we have the superficial glacial deposits on top of that. Then we start to look at wells. So I'm sure, how many have wells? So about half of you. So every one of you that's had a well drilled after about 1975, there is a record that the state has, and it talks about your name, where the address, the latitude and longitude of the well, how deep it is, how much water it's producing, how deep it's cased, and various other information. So you think that, well, this is just one well, but when you start to look in Bennington, where we could find records of about 150 wells in detail, we knew exactly where they were, then we can start pushing things more into the 3rd dimension. So if you look here, you're seeing all the kind of lime green stars, all essentially here in the contamination area. We can put that data all together. This is just one of the maps that we made. For example, if you look at this, is called an isopac map. An isopac map just means equal thickness. And so what this is showing, and it's shown in brown. So the areas where the superficial materials are greater than 20 feet thick and up to 200 feet thick are in these brown polygons. And so why would we care about that? As PFOA, remember from my whole series of going into the sky, falling around, percolating down, the thicker the superficial deposits are and the more porous and permeable they are, we want to know that, because those will be places either where the PFOA transport downward faster or maybe attenuated or held up. The next step in this 3rd dimension was to do well logging, and you've probably never seen this unless you've seen your well being serviced, but here is a 260-foot well. It's pulled out of the hole. You can see right here, here's the pump itself wrapped up, and here's essentially the piping and the wiring harness, all coiled up in 30-foot loops. And what we do, and I won't show you this data, but for every well, we did 17 wells in the area in selected areas where we really needed to know information, more information, and so that the probes can measure the temperature and conductivity of the water, the gamma, the natural gamma, which is what's the natural radioactivity emitted by rock, tells us what type of rock it is, okay? The caliper tool, those 3 arms will actually push against the side of the borehole, tell us how wide it is. So why would you want to know that? Because when you have fractures or cracks coming into the hole, the borehole tends to be wider. So that'll show where that is. An acoustic televiewer is actually a fancy tool that actually makes a 3D radar image of the hole. So you can see what the whole well looks like from top to bottom of the cylinder. And then the last thing we do is we do it first, but I'm showing it last, is lowering a borehole camera down, looking at all the structures. And so we're able to put together a pretty amazing record for each well that we log. And it's all run from a laptop, and this is the 1,500-foot cable spool. So I just told you basically how we put together the 3-dimensional framework, right? It was bedrock mapping, superficial mapping, looking at all the wells, and then logging selected ones so we really get an idea of the 3rd dimension. The next thing we do is actually, remember I talked about 4 tracers. We want to look at PFOA, major and trace element chemistry, stable isotopes, and for selected wells we'll do the groundwater age tracer dating. And so this is actually from this, what we're writing up right now, and I just want to show you all the different data sets that we can use. So this is, if you look in this map, this is the basic contamination area right here. We've gone way out into the Green Mountains because we actually sampled up there. So here's the 600 plus PFOA tests. Remember, in this orange or yellow rectangle is essentially most of the town of Bennington. Here's where we did major and trace element samples. We did like 50 wells, a dozen springs in this area, all the way up into the Green Mountains. We did the isotope tests we did at about 25 sites in this area. And then we also did 18 groundwater age dates. And so the way this kind of ends, and this is just to give you an idea of what we try and come up with and how it might be useful, is so here is a 3-dimensional block model putting all this information together for just part of the study area. So just to go over what we were talking about, so right here is one of those faults. Remember, all the different colors are different rock formations. So here's one fault, here's another fault, going like this. All these squiggles and all that, these are big folds that I pointed on the map. But some of the things we found out is, over here, this western thrust fault, we have recharge of older water along that thrust that has no PFOA. And it's being tapped. You can either tap it on this lowermost slice here, what we call the New York slice, or you can drill through the thrust. Over here on the east side, we have wells that are actually drilled through the eastern thrust, which actually isn't, this is a conduit. It's like a pipe for groundwater. This is actually a barrier for groundwater. So if you drill through this, you drill into vertical fractures that are related to the course of the Walloomsac River that takes all these right angle bends going across the landscape. So we have no PFOA water over here on this thrust fault, none right here in the middle where you're getting actually recharge from just the center of the area, where all the wells are with a really, well, the medium to high PFOA. So this is kind of just to get an idea of what we're doing. I can go into a lot more detail, but I'm not. But we're in the process of getting this all together, and it's really a neat story that involves the oldest water originating by recharging up high in the Green Mountains and making its way along long flow paths that involve faults and fracture zones down to the valley, and then showing up at wells that actually penetrate these various structures. So I'll just wrap it up there.
Burlington, Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Vermont, Dr. Wenjun Zhu from China and Singapore, and now here. He's going to talk more academically and will tie it all together for us.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Good evening, everyone. First of all,
Can everybody hear? No. No.
no,
Let's use it.
okay, sorry. Actually, I'm very busy. You accept my speaking. But anyway, today I'm going to show you a very detailed study we carried out last year, which is about the PFAS in Vermont soils. So I hope that most people now you have some idea about what the PFAS is. And here is our target PFAS. We studied in total of 17 kinds of the PFAS in this study. And some very brief background information which you heard before. So what are PFAS? Many, more than 3,000 kinds. And they are very stable. They have been used since 1940.
I don't know, maybe you need to move away from the receptor because it's
That's fine.
really echoey.
Okay.
Oh, no.
So they are widely applied. For example, the firefighting foam.
No, yeah, pull a little bit away from your mouth.
Oh, okay, sorry. Also, some commercial household products, food packaging, and pins, and all kinds of non-stick products. So that's where you can find the PFAS. So our target PFAS usually they have like from 4 carbons to 18 carbons. They are very stable, and here is the formula of PFOA and the PFOS. So we know that from Richard's talk, you know that they are everywhere. They are in the air, in the water, and in our soils. Also, they're gonna go to the so-called the food chain, and finally go to the plants, crops, animals, and finally human. So motivation, I don't just ignore this part. So we just want to know like the background PFAS level in Vermont soils. So that's our sampling sites. In total was 66, which collected last summer. So you can see actually here, this is around the Newport area. We actually sampled 3 samples around the lake. It's so-called A6, A5, A7, B6. I'm gonna show you the result later. So here is the method. I'm gonna go through this part. And here are some of our results. You can see that's how, like the percentage of detection frequency. For example, the PFOS, you heard this so many times tonight, and this detected in all of the samples. And for the PFOA, in 91% of the soil samples. So all these 10 should be 10 compounds, they are detected with a very high frequency, like less than 30%. Okay, here is the final result. That's the total concentration of PFAS in Vermont soils. So you can see here is the Newport areas, and it's not that clear, but in these areas you can see the height of these bars. They are actually in the range of like from 2,000 to 5,000 ppt level. It's better than Burlington area in this smaller graph. Here it's usually like higher than 5,000 ppt, but it's worse than the southern Vermont. You can see usually these areas they are much lower, maybe in the range like below 2,000. So I would say that if you are literally living here, you need to think about like you are really exposed to PFAS, all kinds of. So the highest level of PFAS is found in here, G6, Norwich Green, around the right river junction. It's around like 35,000 ppt. And the lowest level is here. It's very close to G6 actually. Queen State Park. It's just 540 ppt. Also, we can notice that for in Vermont, we can notice like higher level of total concentration of PFAS in the northern area, especially from A to E, from the top of Vermont to around Burlington area. And generally, below Burlington, the level gonna be much lower. And that's the percentage of each kind of the compounds. Even though they vary quite a lot, you're gonna notice that PFOS, this color on the top, they usually account for the largest proportion, and then the next one gonna be PFOA. So here is the range of these two compounds. Here is the so-called upper tolerance limit we found for all these 10 compounds. Actually, these are just some levels maybe helpful for the future regulation. You can see that PFOS has a very high level, which is around 3,400 ppt. We also do some statistics analysis, but I won't go through the details. Generally, want to know the possible factors affecting the level of PFAS in Vermont soils. Also want to know the possible sources which leading to the high level of the PFAS. So we're gonna use the GIS method to analyze the land use data, which means land cover or what kind of types the land is used. So generally, we're gonna find like several kinds of the PFAS. They are closely related. For example, PFNA, UNDA, and HXA. These four are very close to each other. And also PFOS, they are very close to PFNA, DA, UNDA. NA means 9 carbons, and the DA 10 carbons, UND 11 carbons. Also PFOA is very close to PFHPA. So if they are close to each other, they are supposed to come from very similar sources. So we're gonna try to figure out what kind of sources they are from. You can ignore this figure, it's just some statistical analysis. We just want to point out that in the northern Vermont, you can see there are still some different differences among different regions. For example, around Burlington area, this area usually have much higher concentration. And the pink color, these two, they are lower than Burlington areas, but higher than this part, the middle part. So you can see Newport is here, so it's not that high. Based on the GIS land use study, we found that human activity, so here is the growth of human activities. For example, the residential density and the developed intensity. And under the growth of nature, there are like forest, wetland, and water. So we found that the level of PFAS in Vermont soils, they are positively related to human activities. This means the more human activity in this area, the higher level is expected. However, there are going to be like much less PFAS if there is like this area is surrounded by forest. Here is an example. So you can see the effect of human activity. So if there is the land is used like by more than 50% of human activities, the level of the total PFAS is going to be much higher than those with less human activity. The orange color here. Also, they're going to affect the individual PFAS compounds. You can see like still that's in the Burlington, the northern Vermont. Still, they're going to affect the individual concentration of each compound. So the more human activity, the higher level of each compound. But in the southern Vermont, there's no such trend. So generally, this means that human activity won't affect the level of PFAS in southern Vermont. So generally, we can see that, just summarize our data, you're gonna see that the level of PFAS gonna be affected quite a lot by the human activity. But if there are like less covered by the forest, the level is supposed to be much lower. And these compounds, HXA, NADA, UNDA, and PFOS, they are very close to each other, so they're highly possible from the similar sources. That's in the northern Vermont. But in southern Vermont, there is no such like very close correlation among the compounds or among the land use types. So we wanted to try to figure out what kind of a sources this compound may come from. So based on the correlation results, we will see, for example, PFOA, PFHPA, that's 8 carbon and 7 carbons. They may be from like manufactural, industrial, and the consumer uses, like food packaging. They have actually many different sources. I would say that local sources, like our daily life, gonna affect the level of these 2 compounds. And PFOS, because they actually have very high concentration of overall amounts, we will see that, and they're gonna be strongly affected by the residential density, also the development intensity. This means human activities. We will see that most of the PFOS discovered in Vermont should be from like manufactural and industrial uses. And for the rest 4 kinds, I will see that similar to PFOS, they made from some manufactural and industrial uses. I won't say that exactly which factory or which kind of industry these compounds can be produced, but I will say that, as Richard and Dr. King just said, there may be some, there used to be some factories in Bennington areas, and they can like produce this kind of PFOA and other kind of PFAS compounds. That's definitely a source, a very important source. And for the other areas, if you can see, there may be some industries which gonna use this kind of compound. They may be potentially sources. So to summarize, I will say the PFAS in Vermont soils, they are very widely distributed, and you can discover them, I would say, everywhere. There are 2 dominant PFAS in Vermont soils, PFOA and PFOS. I believe you heard these 2 all the night today. And we can see that our human activity gonna affect the level of PFAS in Vermont soils. This means if there is more human activity, there gonna be higher PFAS. Actually, we're gonna also find that the distribution of PFAS in northern Vermont and in southern Vermont, they are kind of have different trends. I would say like in the northern areas, generally they have higher levels than southern Vermont. Also, these kind of compounds, they are closely correlated and supposing that they are from similar sources. There are several sites, especially G6, KCE, these are around White River junctions. They have extremely high level of PFAS. I would say that they definitely gonna need some further investigation. Yeah. So here is a very brief acknowledgement. Some members from our lab and our collaborator from the Sunburn Head Association. Also, yeah, Richard from Vermont DEC. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, all 4 of you. Wonderful presentations. We're open to questions now. Address your question directly to any of these, or we can question to. Yes.
I saw an article, I haven't read it yet, recently.
Excuse me, if you can't hear us loudly, I can take the microphone to the person.
In Popular Science magazine that said they're working on an enzyme to eat plastic. You seen that? It just came out.
An enzyme to eat plastic?
I haven't seen it, but
I believe there is some type of hoax. It's very exciting to see that, definitely. But based on my understanding, there may be just very few kinds of bacteria who can eat plastic. Also, plastic doesn't mean they contain very high concentration like PFOA. It's exciting, but I would say before they can be applied in reality, we still need to go through a long way. Also, based on my knowledge, usually they are right now at very low efficiency.
Another question? Yes.
I have two questions. There was recently a conference in Northeastern University, and it was suggested that drinking water levels should be at 0.1 part per trillion due to recent research that shows pancreatic cancer. So my question, I guess, is for all of you as regulators or as researchers and scientists. You know, we are now at 20, California is between 13 and 14, and they're saying they're looking to adjusting down given this new evidence that drinking water is much more significantly related to human health. So how do you set, we have 20 parts per trillion in Vermont, and this new research is now saying 0.1 part per trillion. So if the precautionary principle is to be in effect and that we need to do the best practice until we know for sure, where should we be going with this?
Richard?
Sure. So the first thing I'll say is that the health standard for the state of Vermont is set by the state toxicologist. She used much of the tox values, the values that are determined for the risk that these chemicals pose from data that was acquired by EPA. The science is ever changing, and there is new stuff coming along all the time. Whether or not 0.1 parts per trillion is the right place to go or not, I'll leave that for the toxicologist to work on those types of determinations. That's certainly not in my area of expertise. However, one thing I have learned is that there have been a number, two different investigations that I know of, where states have looked at a number of wells that for no particular purpose should be contaminated with PFAS at all. And they have, they've pushed the detection limit down to 0.2 parts per trillion, and almost every well that they tested has levels in them above that level. And it could be because it's in our soils at some background concentration, and it's migrated through the soils at very low levels, currently below what we normally detect for. That's why we have so many non-detects in areas where we sample. But if you can push your detection limit down, we may find it in all water that's newer than 1960 or 1970 when this chemical started being widely used. But if you find older water, as John mentioned from his study, water that's been in the ground for more than 60 years or so, that water would not have any PFAS in it because it was not manufactured and was not a product being discharged into the environment. So even if we believe it should be 0.1, which I'm not saying it is, I don't know, but it may be too late for that. Maybe all water is above that, and maybe we have to treat all water if you're concerned about that. I don't know if that makes you feel any better, but...
It doesn't really make me feel
No,
better. I have a second question.
Sure.
Sorry. So, it's for you, I'm sorry, I don't recall your name, doctor. So you said that there's a higher detection in northern Vermont.
It's not higher,
It's highest in Burlington, but then the northern Vermont is also high. So my question is, in this area, we're extremely low population. There's 15,000 people in Orleans County. So
I agree.
my question is, if you're suggesting or your research shows that human activity is a huge cause of this, and we have very few humans compared to other parts, we do have one contributor, which is the disposal of the entire state of Vermont, which I'm assuming contains all sorts of things. We have a 78-acre dump within 6 miles of here. So if that's full of PFAS and we have less people, could there be a relationship, or what is your opinion of whether that could be a contributor?
Sure, thank you. I didn't go to the general. I think the sources of the PFAS generally are supposed to kind of from two sources, two categories. One is local, like human activities. Another is from like so-called atmospheric deposition, or is kind of a transportation by the surface water or groundwater. I would say there is a study back in 2016, and they found these kind of compounds in Arctic.
Arctic.
Yeah, somewhere, yeah. So in like very remote areas, for these areas there are actually maybe very few people living there, but they may highly possible from like the air or from the, I would say it's a kind of a global thing. So even though, as Richard said, PFOA and PFOS may be not produced anymore in USA, they can still be transported to this land from different pathways, like from the air, from the water, from the ocean, or just from the products. So I would say, based on our finding, like if this area is like has like less residents, they means the sources from human activity may be less. That's why the level is lower. But it doesn't mean that there won't be PFAS from the other like natural transportation sources.
She missed your question altogether.
I'm not so sure whether I answered your question now.
Another question? Yes?
I think someone suggested that you flushed PFOA out of something by using a lot of water. Then I wonder, what do you do with that water that you put the PFOA in? Because what's happening in Newport is that our dump gives us all of its leachate, which we flush through our waste treatment plant. It doesn't take care of PFOAs, and we flush it right into our lake. So untreated, basically, for PFOAs is going into our lake. Do you treat in any way, when you flush, do you treat the water that you accumulate PFOAs in?
From hazardous waste sites, we do. That's what we're doing down in Bennington, but on a limited scale, it's where people are drinking the water. Or, for example, we're going to be cleaning the factory itself, and that wastewater will be treated before it's discharged. We think a lot of the PFOA that's gotten into the wastewater treatment plant in Bennington comes from either groundwater that's leaking into the system because of part of the leaking system because we have so much contaminated groundwater there, or from before the wells had treatment on them, when people would turn on their tap, it would come out of their well and then go in as wastewater. But also we're all contributing to our wastewater treatment plants because it's in us and it's in a lot of the products we use, and when they get flushed into our systems, they end up in the wastewater treatment plant where there's a lot of organic content. John mentioned that it likes to attenuate to this organic content, same in soils, same in granular activated carbon, which is what we use for treatment, and the same in wastewater treatment plants. That's a very high organic content. So it can really accumulate at higher levels in that than normally. And we see it in wastewater. New Hampshire, I just saw data from the state of New Hampshire where they sampled about 30 wastewater treatment plants, septage, and every one of them had pretty high levels of PFO, of all the PFAS bound to the biomatter.
And you do understand that that lake is drinking water for Sherbrooke and many of the towns in Canada.
Sure.
Where we're flushing PFOAs into it.
Yes.
Do you not think that if you're filtering this water for PFOAs in Bennington, shouldn't the wastewater coming out of the dump up here be filtered before it's dumped into the lake?
It's not a project I'm working on, so I'm not intimately familiar with it. But there are certainly people who are working on trying to decide what needs to be done and what doesn't need to be done. And I guess I would have to defer to them to give you the answer to that question.
Who are those people?
Wait a minute. Another question? You have one there?
I have two questions. One to you, Richard. What filtration are you using at the factory in Bennington? What do you do with the, is it carbon filtration?
Yeah, it's granular activated carbon.
When that gets full of whatever, the PFOAs, what do you do with those filters?
So the material goes back to Calgon water systems, and they actually then heat up the carbon material to drive the You know, it absorbs on at low temperature, you can drive it off at high temperature, and then it goes up into an incineration system where the PFAS is incinerated. There is a lot of discussion about how efficient those systems are, and there's a lot of research going on right now to better understand that. There has been lab work to show that it clearly can be, they call it decomposition, but at like 800 degrees C, this thing should completely decompose, but that's only in the lab, so there hasn't been full-scale analysis, and therefore there is work going on right now at both the Department of Defense and EPA to try and better understand that, and to, you know, kind of as we're doing research on toxicology and on soils, what's in soils, there are people doing research on that as well.
So really, you're saying the science is not known on how to dispose of these filters, where presumably there's a greater concentration of the waste.
What I would say is it's not fully understood, it's somewhat understood.
Yeah.
And so there's work going on, the same interest you're expressing, I've heard it many times, we have the same concerns. We're trying to use the best technology we can. A big example came up on that when we recovered AFFF in our take-back program, where we went to fire departments all over the state and collected their AFFF, which is a very highly concentrated source of these chemicals. And then we had to figure out how to get rid of it. And there aren't that many alternatives. And incineration may not be a perfect one, but it was the best one that we could identify. And so we sent it to the hottest incinerator that we could find. It is permitted to take those materials, and they incinerated it. So, but there wasn't a study done to figure out, you know, what the complete decomposition was. There are people working on that, and hopefully we'll know more in the next couple of years.
Is there a question over there? Yes.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming to the Kingdom. I appreciate it. As somebody who has been 3 years without clean drinking water, and I'm hoping July we are going to have clean drinking water from arsenic, I'm highly concerned to hear you say that there's a correlation between arsenic and PFAS and all of them in the filtration process. We have a community water system. So I was wondering if you could possibly, Richard, talk to that a little bit.
So I'm not a chemist, but I'll give you what I understand is going on. When they produce this granular activated carbon, they actually heat it up in a reduced environment, so there's not a lot of oxygen available, and they basically cook it, and then they pulverize it. Well, in that process of creating this reduced carbon, when the water first starts going through it in a reduced environment, arsenic is soluble, and so it will come off that carbon and go into the water, and that's what goes either into your home or through the treatment system or whatever. But that only occurs for a little while because the water that's coming in has oxygen in it. And that oxygen is oxygenating that carbon bed. And eventually, instead of it being a reduced environment, it becomes an oxidized environment. And once that happens, there's still arsenic there, but it's not mobile anymore. It becomes immobile. It changes state, and it doesn't solubilize into the water. And so your water passes through and has no arsenic in it. And we only discovered that. We had heard that may happen, and so we sampled for it. We found that it was happening in maybe 10 or 20% of the systems that we had installed. And so we instructed people to make sure they flushed several hundred gallons of water through their system before they would then start to use it. Many people were still drinking bottled water, and so there was less of a concern, but you know, we have pets, and a lot of people were cooking with it, even though they could use their bottled water. A lot of people, it's not convenient. And so we wanted to try and minimize the extent that would happen to people. And so then we came up with this solution, well, why don't we just pre-treat it before we send these carbon vessels out and sample them to make sure we've already oxidized the bed, and then the arsenic's not mobile, so that we didn't have to worry about that problem. But it took us probably 4 to 6 months to figure that out and get it implemented, and in the interim we have data that this was certainly occurring.
So what would be your plan if there was already test results that are already over the 20 parts? So what would be, what would be a remediation for having to deal with, you know, both of them?
Sure. So I'm not a water treatment person as well, so I don't know exactly what people use for arsenic. I think they usually use a salt system, you know, a water softening system, like a lot of other things. Those metals drop out when you soften your water, but I'm not positive. The one thing I want to say is that the PFOA and the arsenic were not related in any way. One was just a byproduct of treatment. The other was the contaminant we were concerned concerned about. The 20 parts per trillion was for the PFOA in the drinking water. The arsenic level that we were using and reporting to people, I think, was 10 micrograms per liter, which is parts per billion as opposed to parts per trillion. Why all these standards are so significantly different, we'll have to ask the toxicologist. But I mean, it's based on all the receptors that it goes to, and you know that arsenic we've been exposed to for a long time. So there's probably any variety of reasons, but much higher standard. But we exceeded that in some percentage, and so we wanted to try and reduce that possibility.
Is the arsenic in your well from naturally occurring from the rock formations?
So I'm told. So, yeah, I'm assuming. I don't know. I was even refused a water sample. So, I mean, I can't. I have issues with the fire district, so I don't know. That's why I'm trying to find outside resources to draw my own conclusions, I guess. It does say it's naturally occurring in the rock bed, and our well is also, the community well is in the flood zone of the Black River. So we already know that there's contamination in the wetlands close to the Black River with PFAS. So that's my concern as to how it's going to, or if it's not already there.
But do you have an arsenic treatment system?
We are in the process of it right now, so.
I mean, in simple terms, the arsenic treatment systems tend to be basically iron filings. The iron just globs on to the arsenic and removes it. They're kind of expensive, but they're
Yeah, it's about $2 million we're into now.
Let's move on to another question. So everybody gets a chance. Another question? Yes.
Question. You had mentioned, let's see.
Everybody here?
I think it was Richard had mentioned, I can speak up.
Okay.
I think Richard had mentioned that, that the standard for soil is 300 parts per billion.
Correct.
And you said it can be higher, we don't need a lot of soil, right? But if I converted that to parts per trillion, would that be 300,000 parts per trillion?
Correct.
And recently, it seems like I saw an article about Maine and the farmers in Maine that had used biosolids on their crops. Do you know what the parts per trillion in their crops were? Because it seems like the PFAS in the crops was responsible for them having to like dump their milk or whatever that was.
So I don't know the specific numbers, but I saw the webinar that was presented by my counterpart in Maine, and it was a paper, it was short paper fibers. And a lot of the white glossy paper, there was high levels of PFAS used in producing that. And so that would be brought in for recycling and chopped up really fine. And then a lot of farmers receive that on their field as fertilizer, or a lot of them have accepted as bedding for their animals. In this particular farm, they think, and again, it's hard to go back and figure a lot of these details out, but this particular farm had all those short paper fibers spread on their fields, and they had biosolids brought in and spread on their fields. So of course, both entities are doing this, saying, no, it was them, no, it was them. From my counterpart in Maine, they believe it's most likely the short paper fibers that brought it in. They were much, much higher than 300,000 parts per trillion in the soils.
Do you know what it was?
The exact numbers, no, but I'm sure that webinar is online. If you go to Google in NEWMOA, N-E-W-M-O-A, you can go find your way through the website, and you can find that webinar where they talk about the data from that particular incident.
Was it only one farm?
It's only one farm that they found it on. It's certainly, it most likely has happened on other farms as well.
Because I saw two articles that were months apart. One was about a farm having to dump all their milk, and the other one, or you think that might just be one farm?
Well, there was certainly the one farm in Maine. The other agricultural issues I know about here in Vermont, we had the one farm where the well was contaminated with AFFF. Those cows were definitely drinking contaminated water. It was affecting their milk. Probably not above a health standard. Certainly not after they mixed it with all the other milk that was coming in, but the co-op would not take their milk until that water was clean and the cows had been drinking clean water for a period of time. There was also another case in New Mexico where thousands of cows have been slaughtered from drinking. I think those were more for beef cows. No, there were milkers as well, that's right, because they were dumping milk too. And I think they slaughtered 6,000 cows. It was from an Air Force base. So it's a nationwide problem. I mean, this is occurring everywhere.
And that 300 number is a Vermont number or a nationwide number?
It's a Vermont number that was set for Bennington just for PFOA. As we identify other issues, I suspect other PFASs will be brought in, and standards will be set for them as well.
Another question?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it, but you mentioned maple syrup, and you said you got a value of a liquid coming out of the tree initially of only being 8 parts per trillion.
Per billion.
But, per trillion. But,
in the sap.
but the person who makes maple syrup then takes that liquid that comes out of the tree and they boil off the water and boil off the water and boil off the water until they get maple syrup.
Yep.
So in the process, does the PFOA concentrate
Or go up in the air.
or go up in the air?
So I don't know the answer to that question. I said it would be a great research project for a graduate student or a PhD student to do, because one of the interesting things was our detection limit for PFOA in the syrup was less than 30 times higher than parts per trillion. I think it was maybe 200 parts per trillion. But I did the math and I was like, well, if it just went from sap to syrup, we should have seen it in the syrup as well, and we didn't. Now, it was a different tree, it was a different time, there are other possible explanations, but it would be a fascinating research project to say, let's take the sap, take some samples, boil it, we'll collect the moisture that's coming off, sample that, and then sample the syrup in the end and try and figure out what's the mass balance for the PFOA in the syrup. I won't stop eating my syrup though, so.
Back here, yes.
Really, just great
Everybody here?
explainers.
No.
You're great explainers, and I really appreciate the information. I thank you for being here, and I thank you, MWA, for being here. What I'm hearing is that this is not a settled science by any means, that it's a global issue, and that it very much specifically relates to the way we dispose of waste globally, because landfills are a repository for household waste that contains these PFAS family of chemicals, for industrial waste that contains even more highly concentrated sources of the same, demolition waste, etc., right? And so this does specifically relate to our concern around the landfill in Coventry. And I guess getting back to this idea that the lady over here brought up about the precautionary principle, I feel like when I talk to the ANR or the Department of Environmental Conservation, I'm being asked to answer the question, well, how can you prove that this will be harmful? Dumping 15,000 gallons a day of leachate, which contains measurable levels of PFAS, into the lake. And I just want to ask, why is it up to me to prove that it's harmful? Why isn't it up to you to, or not you, I'm sorry, ANR, to prove to me that it's not harmful?
So I don't know the answer to your question. I do know there are people working on that problem, both at ANR and at the landfill, and probably other people that I don't even know about, trying to figure out to answer those questions that you're concerned about. Certainly in Bennington, that's exactly what we did. The community came and said, what about the fish? What about the maple syrup? What about our garlic? And we went out and tried to answer those questions. It takes a lot of time and a lot of resources to try and do that. And so I think there are people working on that. Whether they'll get you to a satisfactory answer or not, I don't know. But they're going to get you the best answer they can get you, and then you'll have to decide if it's acceptable
But in
or not.
the interim, we keep dumping the leachate into the lake.
Right.
And I guess that's my major concern. Why not have a moratorium until we know more?
Let Emily
So,
give her
thank you.
2 cents in this.
So here's my 2 cents. I totally agree about the precautionary principle. I think not just Vermont, but I think we as a nation really do need to start to adapt this type of notion of maybe we shouldn't be putting it into the environment until we know a little bit more. I did have the experience of meeting Rob Willott, the lawyer who actually sued DuPont and created the C8 Health Panel. And he vehemently believes that it should not be the NIH, it shouldn't be taxpayers funding these studies to prove that it's harmful. So he actually is suing, I think there's a case for all the different companies that created these chemicals to fund more studies. It's kind of setting the standard of, it should be the companies that created these chemicals to fund these types of studies. So there is hope.
There are also a number of states that are suing these companies as well.
Sorry.
We couldn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Want to say it again,
What did you
Richard?
say?
There are also a number of states who have begun to start suing these companies for defective product suits.
The original point source.
DuPont and 3M, the original manufacturer of the material. I think the state of New York has actually also sued them. They're really focused on AFFF because they have a number of Air Force bases that have caused significant problems. And so they're also suing the AFFF manufacturers on top of DuPont, Chemours, and 3M.
Yep.
I have, this is a legal question, since none of you are lawyers, I'm not sure who to address it to. Assuming that the leachate, which is going into this lake, which provides drinking water for, I think it's 175,000 Canadians, should they find that their drinking water is contaminated, would Canada then be able to sue the United States? Would Quebec be able to sue Vermont? What happens, because water doesn't know that there's a boundary 4 miles out there. So I just, this lady mentioned, why are we still doing this when if we live here and it's our health and it's the health of 175,000 Canadians, why is there nobody who has the authority, the government, the Vermont, I'm not sure who can put some public knowledge out there and maybe some common sense that toxicity is a problem and we all know it, but so my question, I guess, would be, why are we still doing this?
Who has common sense? Anybody want to pick that up? Or it's a question I don't think we can come up with an answer for. That's why we're here.
Maybe there's a lawyer.
I mean, I'm sure it's nothing any of us have the power to do anything about. We each have our specialties that we're working on, and I work on hazardous waste sites, and I don't work on landfills, so the people who are working on the landfills are working on those questions, but I don't know what the answer is at this point.
Another question? Yes.
Yes. Hi, thank you also for coming. I really appreciate this. You mentioned the drinking water, the soils, and potential breathing. Is there any potential, you mentioned that I think probably the toxicologists may have this information, that you talked about within the body, some contamination going across the placenta. What about us wearing things that have these chemicals in it, or working with things? What are our potential toxicity to ourselves or people around us?
So the answer to that is we don't know yet. I'm actually helping to study, this is kind of for graduate students coming after me, some effects of, do these cross the skin? They're found in like foundations and certain makeups. And we're wondering, okay, if we apply the makeup, does that mean it's going to cross the skin? So it is an area that toxicologists are addressing, but unfortunately, these types of studies move a lot slower.
I mean, the one thing we do know, FDA just came out with a report. It's used in a lot of food products so that your food doesn't stick to the packaging. And in that process, it comes off the packaging and gets into the food. And then we cook it and we eat it. And that's probably, I'm not an expert in this, but it's probably a much higher route of exposure than anything we're going to put on our skin, just because the skin has a certain ability to protect ourselves. And once it gets into our digestive tract, it can easily be absorbed into the bloodstream and where it can go to the target organs and things like that. That's what little experts are talking about.
I really appreciate that answer, because the last time I heard Governor Scott asked about that specific question, or about the effect of PFAS, he said, oh, well, there's probably PFAS in your vest, to the person who asked the question. And I just thought, that is a really inadequate answer. I apologize, but I'm sort of starting at a lower level of knowledge. We are serving about 1,200 pre-K to 12th graders within the public water source here in Newport. And I just wondered, what is the difference between the water that's coming through the public system versus well waters? Because we were sort of discussing the difference between testing in Bennington and in wells versus public water systems, and sort of wondered what is the effect in Newport potentially for children who might be drinking this water in our public schools.
So I don't know if Newport's been tested yet, but there was legislation just passed in this session that all public water systems have to be tested by December 1st. That's about 700 systems in the state, and I'm sure Newport will be one of them. So we'll know better what's in your water once that information is collected.
And if your grandchildren went to school in this community, what would you say was an adequate level?
I'm not sure. I mean, it's certainly, as I said, it's a worldwide problem. It's probably in all water at some level that isn't of some great age. You know, I spoke with so many people in Bennington who had to answer these questions for themselves. What do I do when I have 14 parts per trillion? Do I drink the water? Do I not drink the water? Several people told me, oh, I wish we were over 20, at least then I could get a treatment system and maybe get connected to municipal water. So it's certainly a very personal question that's very difficult for us to answer. But the regulatory answer is if it's less than 20, you're allowed to drink the water, and there's nothing I can do directly to any polluter to make them clean that water.
But you can advocate.
I can advocate and I can study it to make sure it doesn't go above 20 if you have it. The real solution to me is we have to get it out of our products. Then it won't get into our leachate, it won't get into our septic systems or our wastewater treatment plants. And how do we get it out of the products when we're doing this dance from the C8s to all these other PFASs? It's such a useful chemical. These companies really want to use it, and these are products that we really want to buy. It's a really tough nut to crack.
But we can do both at the same time.
Find alternatives, yeah, and try and clean up our problems at the same time. I know in Bennington, the remedy that we had for the overall community was we've written off that aquifer. There's no way for us to clean it. It's huge. It's 15 square miles by however thick John decides it is at any given point. You know, tens of feet to hundreds of feet thick. And the soil is an ever-giving source. It's that sponge that just keeps giving the PFOA off to the aquifer. So even if we could clean the water today, there'd be new PFOA to come back from the soil and contaminate the water. So the remedy is to protect the people by providing public water or treatment systems. But as far as the environment, we can't really clean that up. We're just going to wait and watch it and let nature take its course.
Yes?
What is the treatment for Bennington municipal water? You keep saying they have okay water.
Right. So fortunately, the water for the city of Bennington is coming mostly from the Green Mountains. It either comes by overland flow in the brook where they collect part of it, or it comes into a spring that's probably older water that comes from much further out in the Green Mountains. And so we've sampled that, I don't know, a dozen times, and we've never found any PFAS in it. And North Bennington is a series of wells and overburden water that comes down from the Green Mountains. And again, they're in the right place to be protected and not be exposed to the atmospheric deposition that occurred from the factory, like all the private wells that were near it. So fortunately for us, it would be much tougher. In Pownell, where the municipal system has been contaminated, or also in Clarendon at the airport where they're contaminated, we've put in large carbon vessels to take these contaminants out of the water and then send them to the distribution system for people to use. But they're large and expensive and complicated.
So carbon filtration system in your own kitchen, does that take them out?
So it will, but they're incredibly, because the PFAS molecule is tough, we don't know how long it'll last. A new one will definitely work. How long it'll work, we don't know. Is it weeks? Is it months? Is it maybe a year? We just don't know. There hasn't really been any work done on that. So the answer is yes, but for how long? Because eventually all the spaces where these contaminants get attached to get filled, and then the contaminants work their way through the system into your water supply.
But if you're using a carbon filtration that you change every 2 or 3 months,
You'd certainly reduce. You might eliminate it. You'd certainly reduce it.
Yes.
And other contaminants as well, like
yeah,
lead
right.
and other things. So.
You've asked a question. Let Beth ask you. Go ahead, Beth.
I had a question about the toxicity levels. You mentioned that the endpoint was the developmental toxicity, and I assume that's chronic, not acute. And if it's chronic, how many years for the exposure? In the development of the 70 parts per trillion, you know,
So-
there's an exposure, the risk exposure factor. I also assume it's ingestion of contaminated water of 70 parts per trillion. And is it over a certain period of time? And is it a certain volume?
So how these numbers are calculated, it's kind of like an extensive math where they take a study where they look at a specific endpoint and they figure out, okay, at what dose is that happening? And the developmental toxicity for the EPA standard is actually based in rodents. So what they did is they kind of extrapolated out as to what that dose would be for human exposure. And then they go back and calculate, okay, cool, if a human were to have this chronic exposure that they saw in rats, what would that mean for drinking water? What would that level have to be in drinking water? So it isn't simply just taking a number. There's a little bit more to it than that, where we also have these kind of uncertainty factors of, you know, we don't know what the exact number, we don't know how many drinks a person has for a day, and so those uncertainties are already calculated by the EPA.
Okay, but if you drink it one time at 70 parts per trillion,
You're not going to have an effect. Yes, it's a chronic exposure.
And I had a question too for you about the, you showed the map of Vermont, but you couldn't tell where anything was. And so I'm wondering if you have a map that has, I'd be interested to see where your shallow soil samples were collected in relation to industry and manufacturing.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I didn't mention this. Actually, we collect all the samples from so-called public properties. They are not supposed to be polluted by known or suspected PFAS sources like wastewater treatment plants or like fire station. So we generally collect samples from forest, park, or just lawn, also some other grass. So these are supposed to be not exposed to that PFAS sources. But however, I would say the surrounding environment, like surrounding land use, still can impact the levels of the PFAS in soils. I would say it's not only a global thing. It's gonna kind of the air, water, and soil. They are connected to each other, so they can transport from soil to water, and then water can just also transport these compounds into soils. So we didn't work on Bennington areas, which we know there used to be some factories producing such compounds. We are supposed to get some so-called background information from areas not supposed to be polluted by this kind of compounds. So it's my fault not mentioning that. But we are also surprised by the results when we initially got them, because they are supposed to be for example, some of them collected from really forests, but there are still very high levels of the PFAS.
So did you make an assumption that that was atmospheric deposition in those cases?
Yeah. I think air deposition gonna be a very important sources, especially in some so-called remote areas when there is very low residence. I just want to share some of my ideas. I would say as a researcher in this area, I would say there is a hope that, and people are working very hard trying to find some so-called alternatives or to degrade such kind of compounds. It's just going to take some time. Remember that it's produced in 1940s. They have been produced for more than 70 years. They have accumulated in the environment for 70 years. They're going to be I would say millions of tons of these compounds released to the environment. We just need some time. And I would say that your concerns are actually very important. They're gonna raise the so-called public attention to this problem. I would say that with the so-called cooperation with government and our researchers, we wanted to find out the solution for these kind of contaminations. But that's gonna need some time. Okay, just be patient. I won't promise you that it's gonna be figured out like within 10 years or 20 years. It maybe take like even longer time, but they are already there. We just need to find a way to remove them or degrade them. Thank you.
Can I add two quick things about that?
Sure.
One is we encourage you to do a webinar as well with this group, NMOA, that I mentioned, and her presentation, her webinar is on that webpage. So if you are deeply into her work, you could go there. Or also she's going to print, hopefully publish in some journals, which should help. The other thing is we weren't sure where to sample, so about 3 or 4 years ago, the agency went out, we were mandated by the legislature to go out and do a background study for arsenic, lead, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are another contaminant that probably move through the atmosphere and are in soils everywhere and we're all exposed to every day. And so we did that background study and we picked areas that we believed would not be contaminated, state parks, playgrounds, a lot of places like that. And when you piggybacked on that study and picked a subset, probably about half the sites that we sampled for that, to sample for PFAS. And so those were the locations that were chosen. So that, if that helps any out.
Okay, it's after 9 o'clock, well after 9 o'clock, so I think we should quit because they have a long way to go to get back home. Thank you for the presentations and thank you for great questions.
Thank you very much, panel. I think we all learned a lot, and I remind everybody, as I've said it several times, we can be the solution. We do need to aggressively stop spreading these things and making them part of our waste management problem. And it's omnipresent, it's not just local. So, thank you all for coming. I hope you got to see the beautiful sunset that we finally had.